All right. Welcome all to our webinar today on the new US-China Joint Declaration on Climate, what's inside and what's next. My name is Van Dai. I'm the director of the California-China Climate Institute, and I will be the facilitator for today's discussion. We know that during the second week of COP26 in Glasgow, the US and China released another indication of their collective commitment to tackling the climate crisis, which is the US-China Joint Glasgow Declaration on Climate. We're very delightful today to have you all here this morning or evening, wherever you are, to discuss the declaration, its contents, as well as future opportunities for strategic coordination or competition between the US and China on climate issues. So before we get started, a couple quick housekeeping notes here. We're recording this event today and it will be available later on our website. The event is being simultaneously translated. At the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see this icon, the global icon. You can choose the audio channel you want to hear, either English or Chinese. During the discussion, if you would like to ask a question, there is the Q&A function also at the bottom of the screen. We'll try to answer those questions live today. Without further ado, I'd like to begin by introducing our speaker, Vance Wagner. Vance is the Vice President of Strategic Partnership for Energy Foundation China. Previously, he was the China counselor in the Office of Special Envoy for Climate Change at the US Department of State during Obama administration. Well, he led US-China dialogue and collaboration on climate change and clean energy. Vance is a well-known expert to us all on US-China climate relations and a long-time friend and supporter of the Institute. Thank you. I'd like to turn it over to you, Vance, to offer some opening remarks for today's discussion.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Van, and hello to everyone. It's my pleasure to kick the discussion off. Just want to confirm everyone can hear me okay? Okay, good. So look, as Van mentioned, I've been working on US-China climate relationship for a number of years, for about 15 years, and I've seen it from multiple perspectives, including from in China, working for Chinese institutions, from here in the US, working for international NGO philanthropies, and also from where I negotiated many statements like this directives. Let me start by saying that the declaration is impressive. I'm getting an internet connection unstable. Can you still hear me okay? Sorry about that. So let me start by saying that the declaration is impressive, and I give a lot of credit to the negotiating teams from both sides who worked long and hard to achieve it. Statements like these may sometimes seem like diplomatic non-speak to casual outside observers, but they are hugely important for baselining in a formal international communication a country's priorities and commitments around which future international engagement will be organized. So I want to talk about why the statement is meaningful from both geopolitical and substantive perspectives. So for starters, China and the United States are the world's two largest emitters, together responsible for around 40% of global emissions. So just in terms of physical emissions, these two countries play outsized roles in determining the future of the climate. But just as importantly, the United States is the world's largest developed country, and China is the world's largest developing country. And historically, in the context of the global climate negotiations, the rest of the world has often looked to these two countries to identify what's possible, to forge consensus, to chart a viable path forward, to inspire and to build momentum. We saw that in the run-up to Paris in 2015, and we saw that last month. As I mentioned, the US-China Declaration was released in the middle of week 2 of the COP. It made front page news, and I think it injected a lot of hope into the negotiations at a critical time. Let's also not forget that the declaration comes at a time of deep challenge and profound conflicts in the overall US-China relationship. But the very existence of the declaration and the willingness of both sides to release it shows that the two countries recognize that even during this time of challenge, it is still in both countries' interests and in the global interest to come together in dialogue and have some level of communication, coordination, engagement on jointly addressing the climate crisis. But it's not just about geopolitics and signals and momentum. The substance of the declaration is also meaningful. For starters, there is some new and important content. Two big things that stand out to me are the content on, on tackling methane in paragraph 8 and the establishment of the new working group in paragraph 16. I especially like that the working group mentions engaging non-government experts in exchanges. But there are other new things as well. I'm looking forward to today's discussion, really digging in. Before I close, I want to call your attention to one of the simplest, but also the most substantive elements of the declaration, and that's the title. So the official title is the US-China Joint Glasgow Declaration on Enhancing Climate Action in the 2020s. And I think that that second half of the title is important. The title instantly and correctly focuses the conversation on the biggest gap in global climate action right now, which is the need to significantly increase near-term ambition and action. To solve climate change, we know we need to reach net zero emissions by around mid-century, and thankfully both countries have made mid-century net zero pledges. The US by 2050, China by 2060. And while we celebrate those long-term targets, we also must keep our attention focused on the near-term actions, policies, plans, and programs that will bend the emissions curve down as quickly as possible to ensure we meet not just a 2-degree world, but a 1.5-degree one. We also know that every 1/10 of a degree matters, so seeing the world's 2 largest emitters commit to engaging each other on accelerating near-term action is hugely important for keeping 1.5 alive. So I'll stop there. There are a lot of interesting questions to discuss around expectations for reporting out and updating the commitments in the declaration, what the working group looks like and how it might compare to working groups established during the Obama administration, how best to optimize the non-government engagement, the proper balance of cooperation and smart competition in this new era of engagement, and many more. And I look forward to discussing all those things today. So thank you again, Fan, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Vance, for offering your very insightful comments on the declaration and also teeing up some very interesting questions that I'm sure we will be getting into for today's discussion. So next, I would like to introduce Deborah Silligan. Deborah is an assistant professor of political science at Valleona University, also a Woodrow Wilson Institute China Fellow, and an associate at the Center for Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. So she's also a senior associate with the trustee chair in Chinese business and economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She's an expert in environmental governance and US-China relations. I'd like to invite Deborah to walk us through the declaration itself and what was included in the declaration. Deborah, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Fan. Let me share a couple of slides where I just want to get some of the baseline that Vance has already mentioned to you, but give everybody a picture in their heads, I think. So, you know, when we talk about the US and China, I think there are 2 reasons why we really focus on them. And the first is shown in this emissions graph. And I like this one because it captures both total current emissions and the level of historic emissions. And you can see that US is by far the largest historic emitter and the second largest current emitter, but China is now the largest current emitter. Now, of course, that's in total and not in per capita terms, but China has now exceeded the world average in per capita terms, which is quite a dramatic difference from just a decade ago. So the first reason we really care about the US and China and what the two countries say is these are the two biggest emitters, and what they do is critically important to whether we can accomplish anything on climate change. The second reason is that we have a lot of work to do. So this is, one of many of these scenario ranges, and it gives you kind of where we were headed, with 2010 policies, and these are sort of the current policies. And the commitments prior to Glasgow had us around here if everybody lived up to their commitments. And the best case I've seen for where we were after Glasgow, adding together all the commitments, all the pledges, both the things that are sort of formal and informal and in different agreements. Some people have thought that maybe we got to the 1.8 range. Maybe we're really a little higher. And that, of course, depends on everybody doing everything they can. And I think we're all agreed that we really want to get to maintaining temperature change at this 1.5 degree number, because as we see right now, where temperature has already risen 1.1 degrees above the world average, the historic average, we're already suffering. We're suffering floods, droughts, fires, everything, right? And so what we really need is to move quickly and in concert globally to address these. So this is sort of just to give everybody a quick image of what it is that we need to do. And clearly the US and China are the two key players. I think the other thing that was leading into Glasgow was that prior to Paris in 2015, it was a pair of US-China joint agreements that really set essentially the structure for Paris. And so there's been an expectation throughout the climate process that the US will be a leader, even though the US is not a very good leader. The Europeans have clearly been much more consistent in what they've done, and the US is by far the world's most inconsistent country when it comes to climate change. There is no other country that has dropped out of two agreements, right? The Kyoto Protocol and then the Paris Agreement. So there's an expectation of US leadership, but then there's this expectation the US and China are the two biggest emitters. So we, of course, need to see what kind of structure they gave. Now, in terms of Glasgow, the US and China offered no structure in advance, right? We saw nothing from them prior. And I will say the Glasgow meeting was really unusual. And I'm quite interested to hear what Xiaohua thinks about this. All the previous meetings that we've had focus on one agreement at the end. And at Glasgow, the big action was actually very early on with this series of pledges. And the pledges are very different from a negotiated agreement, because within the UN negotiated agreement process, it's basically a consensus document. There's a lot of least common denominator. Everybody has to agree. And the pledges were a very different approach, where different countries or small groups of countries proposed a specific commitment and got other countries to sign on with essentially a take it or leave it approach. And so these pledges range from a deforestation, attacking deforestation pledge that has well over 100 signatories, to a pledge to phase out coal pretty quickly that has 20 something countries signing on. So these were really where the big new commitments came in. The US and China signed on to the deforestation one. The US pushed the methane one and the Chinese did not sign it. Neither country signed on to the coal one. And then there are a whole bunch of others on electric cars, trucks, planes. There are all kinds of different pledges. I counted 7 or 8 of them in total. And so this put a lot of the action at the beginning. And then, frankly, the Glasgow meeting was starting to drag. And people were not sure what more they were going to see out of it. And the US-China bilateral joint declaration really, it did inject some new excitement and energy into the conference. It was a surprise, rather impressive of the two countries to be able to keep the fact that they were this close to negotiations a secret. And I really have to hand it to Secretary Kerry in particular, because it's the US side that usually is busy tooting its own horn for some quick, easy press. But keeping it a secret made it much more dramatic. And I think it was a great idea. And so let's get into the details of the agreement. And I think Vance has already given you a bunch. I'm not sure that I'm going to actually give you a whole bunch more. So I thought one of the things that was really important was that the language was much more direct than we've ever seen in a statement from the US or China. And it was more direct than what they finally wound up with in the agreement at the end of Glasgow. I particularly liked that the country said they were alarmed by the current level of emissions and climate change. I mean, that kind of vibrant language is not something that we've seen in previous bilateral agreements, and I think really shows a willingness on the part of both countries, and especially on the part of China, to not beat around the bush, that this is a serious, serious problem, and we both intend to. We kept this 1.5 degree commitment there. It's to make best efforts. It's not a promise to get there, but that number, I think, because the other thing about my feeling at Glasgow is, despite the fact that the countries can't get rid of this two degrees, which they really should, and just focus in on 1.5, the actual consensus is that we can't go past 1.5. And I do think the world community is moving in that direction, and we had that in the bilateral agreement. The other critical thing was this commitment to accelerated action in the 2020s. So not just long-term, as Vance said, but that we're going to do things now. And this is really important for both countries, because we really don't get to 1.5 if we don't essentially get a move on it now. Now, there's huge range of cooperation, a lot of different stuff in the agreement. And I don't know that what I would emphasize is that much different than what Vance did. The methane part was really important because the Chinese had not signed on to the methane pledge. I really don't know how much time they had to review it and get kind of clearances in Beijing, which is always an issue in China. But they did sign on to the deforestation one. So they were not totally averse to pledges, which traditionally I would expect them to be. So getting some really strong methane language into the bilateral agreement, I think, was a major step forward. The countries also pledged to use their domestic laws to support this deforestation pledge. Now, neither the US nor China is in itself a deforestation country, right? And in fact, the Chinese have probably done more reforestation in the last 80 years than any other country in the world, right? Going from 8.6% forest cover to over 23% today. But both countries are big consumers of products produced on deforested land in tropical countries in particular, right? So palm oil from Southeast Asia, soy from Brazil. And so using domestic law to support efforts to prevent deforestation is going to be really, really important. And that type of approach has proven to be successful in the past for illegally harvested timber. And this suggests that both countries are going to be looking at their domestic laws to move beyond just illegally harvested timber to focus on the products that come, because the real issue now is when you essentially clear cut these areas and grow something else. So I thought that was a really good plus. There's also this commitment to meetings. Now, two areas that I would highlight as problems. The first is that neither country signed on to the coal pledge, and we really do need to phase out coal. I realize at different rates in the US and China. I don't expect that China will be able to phase it out as quickly as the US ought to. But both countries should be focusing more on coal than they did at the Glasgow meeting. And the second is that the language on finance is pretty vague. They commit to this global $100 billion goal, but they don't commit to what either country is actually going to do. This has been a perennial problem for both countries. The politics are different in the US. The politics are trying to get money out of our Congress, which is the same as trying to get water out of a stone. And in China, the issue is more, definitions of developing country and what the responsibility really should be. But if we're going to get to these kinds of finance numbers, we're going to need a great deal more commitment. And I don't see language in this bilateral agreement that moves that conversation forward. But finally, the thing that I do want to point out is the US-China relationship is not good right now. And I don't think that's going to change anytime in the near future. That we just have so many different issues on which we conflict. Now, I think we could, with a little more sensitivity on both sides, solve some of them. I do actually think we could work much more closely on public health. I've seen some very interesting proposals out there for how to deal with some of the geopolitical type issues. But right now, it doesn't appear that there's an appetite in either country to actually do that. And that's why I wrote the column that I did yesterday in the New York Times, which I'm essentially arguing we can do this even if we don't have close cooperation. That as long as the US and China agree on what the goals are, I mean, there's all kinds of cool stuff that we could research together, absolutely. But we already have the technology. We know how to reduce emissions, what kinds of vehicles, what kinds of power plants, the need to electrify our homes and our businesses. All of this we know what to do. And so what really matters is just the basic point that we agree on what the goal is. And I do think this joint declaration moves us in that direction. And I think it's very important that we don't base too much of our expectations of progress on any idea of close coordination, because I think we will then be disappointed. And, I worked a lot closely with Chinese partners, and I've had the experience in the past, for example, when working on public health, where one of these geopolitical issues pops up and 6 months of cooperation just gets stalled because the politics gets too dicey. We don't have time for that on climate change. I don't think we do on other issues as well, but we certainly don't on climate change. And I think it's really important to realize that the hard work that each country has to do is very much domestic transformation of its own energy system. And if we share this goal, we can do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Deborah. That was really broad and also just pointing out so many questions or problems that I think it would be really interesting to go into in more depth of, how this would actually what the areas of cooperation mentioned in this declaration would be politically feasible, especially in the near term in the 2020s. So now I'd like to hear some comments about the political reception of this declaration at COP and beyond. For this, I'll invite Li Shuo, who is Senior Global Policy Advisor from Greenpeace East Asia. Li Shuo leads the organization's engagement with multilateral environmental agreements, such as the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and Convention on Biodiversity. And domestically, he oversees Greenpeace's work on air pollution, water, and renewable energy. Li Shuo, over to you for some comments.
Hey, thanks, Fan. Good morning, everybody, and greetings from Beijing. I know I will be in trouble speaking after Debbie and Vance, but I will try to say something in addition to what they have already said, and I'll try to make three brief reflections related to where we are with regard to global climate forces, COP26, and also the US-China climate engagement. My first point is plain and simple: we are not doing enough with regard to our climate action and ambition. 2021 has been an eventful year in terms of climate policy announcements and pledges. Just here in China, in April, the country pledged to peak its coal consumption by 2025. It decided to ratify the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, an international treaty regulating potent greenhouse gases. And also in September at the UNGA, the Chinese president announced that it will stop supporting overseas coal-fired projects. And in the meantime, the country has been making some progress in delivering its 2030 and 2060 climate commitments. I think the list of commitments and pledges from elsewhere in the world will go even longer. But again, even if we add all of them together, the organization Climate Action Tracker tells us the world is far from being on track with the temperature control goal outlined in the Paris Agreement, which is stay well below 2 degrees and to pursue 1.5. We are actually on track to 2.4 degrees if all the pledges that are put on the table are actually fulfilled, and that is a big if we know anything about the history of climate politics. When we actually need to reduce emissions based on 2010 level by 2030 by 45%. The current climate targets, NDCs, are putting us on the trajectory of increasing emissions by 13%. So clearly a lot of work is still ahead of us. My second point related to Glasgow, COP26, is I think that is, the meeting is sort of a result of a new US-China climate dynamic in that their diplomacy and also diplomacy at a multilateral level helped us to prevent the worst, but the underlying politics shifted hardly at all. And I'm saying that because I think on the positive side, COP26 managed to achieve some of the relatively easier tasks, including the completion of the so-called Paris rule books. This is, a set of provisions and rules related to how countries should report and verify their emissions and so on. And I think, we managed to get that completed partly because of the political willingness from both the US and China to honor the agreements that they made previously. But three major challenges remain, and they are largely unresolved by the COP. Number one, the ambition in the targets in some of the countries, including China, is still insufficient. Number two, some countries in 2021 has updated and enhanced their climate targets, but so far there's no convincing explanation from these countries in terms of how they will actually get the targets delivered. And number three, a long-standing problem in multilateral climate forces, which is climate finance. Developed countries are still falling short on their financial commitment. My third and last point, related to the US-China climate engagement, specifically the Glasgow joint statement. I think on one hand, the joint statement shows you what is still possible. in US-China bilateral engagement. I think that point has already been made well by Vance and Deborah. I would only just say that this demonstrates the resilience of the willing of climate cooperation and engagement by these two countries, and I think the credits would go to some of the colleagues who are presented on this call today. But we should not take engagement for granted because of the problematic bilateral relationship. There is still a lot of work for us to do to keep the bilateral climate engagement on track, and to that end, I think some of the key elements outlined by the Glasgow statement will be critical in 2022. In particular, the bilateral joint working group on climate change, and also the sectorial cooperation, which I'm sure we will hear from subsequent speakers. But I think on the other hand, the joint statement also tells us what is not possible anymore in between the G2. One very critical issue for COP26 is how do we deal with the insufficient national climate targets, the so-called NDCs. And in this regard, the US-China joint statement had an answer, but that answer is a very modest one. It only recalled basically the Paris Agreement language, which is very, very modest. But on the other hand, in the COP decision, the multilateral deal that all the countries reached in Glasgow, it actually ventured much further by calling on all the countries to revisit and strengthen their NDC by the end of 2022. So in other words, the multilateral deal ventured much more and much beyond the bilateral US-China agreement. So in that sense, we actually reversed the Paris US-China climate cooperation model that Debbie mentioned, which is the G2 providing basically the gold rule for the rest of the world, only for the world to adopt it and sort of paste it into the Paris Agreement. This time, we're only having the US and China setting the floor for the multilateral exercise to build on from there. That tells us many things. For one thing, even if the two sides individually are willing to commit to something stronger, they're not willing to commit to each other in the bilateral setting anymore. And number two, I think the rest of the world is not necessarily waiting for the G2 to get their bilateral act together because of the climate urgency and emergency that is in the real world. So I think there will be a limit. I think this is just kind of a long-winded way of saying there will be a limit of US diplomacy in the age of turbulent US-China bilateral relationship and the inability of the US to galvanize its own domestic climate agenda. But on the other hand, that is not to say that US engagement does not matter. I want to make that point very clear. I think there's a lot of nuance in what will work and what will not work, when and how engagement might be the most effective. And I think that is something that we should unpack further as it relates very much to the bilateral engagement as well as multilateral climate politics going forward in 2022. So with that, I turn it back to Fan and look forward to subsequent speakers and our discussion. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Li Shuo. And I think you raise a really interesting point, which is the limit of climate diplomacy. And sort of going back to Deborah's point, for some of those things, both the countries know how to do it already, and it's not really a matter of cooperation or they compete with each other. It's how they do it domestically as well. Okay, let's now turn to some of those key areas for those of you already mentioned in this joint declaration. For this session, we're going to focus on three elements. One is electrification, second on methane, and third on deforestation. Let me introduce the three panelists all together for this session, and we'll then proceed in sequence. First, we'll hear about decarbonization and electrification of end-use sectors from Assistant Professor Michael Davidson at UC San Diego. Davidson's research focuses on engineering and institutional challenges of deploying renewable energy at scale, and some of his research focuses on China. Second, we'll hear from Ken Alex on methane. Ken is director of Project Climate at University of Berkeley's Center for Law, Energy, and Environment. And methane is one of his areas of specialty. Previously, Ken was senior advisor to Governor Jerry Brown and director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and the chair of Strategic Growth Council of California, focusing on climate, environment, and land use issues. Finally, we'll hear from Ke Dong, Director of China Global Engagement at TNC Asia Pacific region. Ke leads and provides support to TNC China, Asia Pacific, and global teams in developing and implementing China's global engagement plan, including China's natural climate solution strategy and zero deforestation China commodity footprint strategy. She'll share her thoughts on deforestation-related issues. Now let's proceed with Michael. Over to you.
Thanks, Fan. Thanks, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be with you all. So before I get into the nuts and bolts of the decarbonization of the energy sector, I wanted to just raise maybe just 2 minutes here to talk about how the evolving climate situation really should cause us to redefine what we think of as US-China cooperation on climate. And I think that's because the Paris process is proceeding. And we need additional elements now to ensure successful emissions reductions. We need to ratchet up near-term pledges 2030, which is the focus of the declaration today. But we also need to make sure that we have continually cheaper low carbon technologies and new innovations that can be scaled up in time to meet the climate crisis. Those primarily come in the decarbonization and end use sector, and US and China are the two most important actors in there. So I feel like that's the goal, that's the target of where we should be going when we talk about US-China cooperation on climate change. And maybe I'll just draw an aside here that I don't really want to draw thick lines between coordination and cooperation and competition. We need all of them. In fact, to facilitate robust competition, we're actually going to need a lot more significant coordination and cooperation, much more than has been displayed by both countries in the year to date. And I think that is a key function of discussions on US-China cooperation on climate, is how to facilitate robust competition in these sectors. And so I'd like to focus maybe on redefining, reorienting the goals of climate change cooperation to really facilitate this robust competition for technologies, which I'll talk about in a second, capital, talent. We have a report out from the Center of Commerce Diplomacy here at UC San Diego that basically makes the case that climate change cooperation requires trade coordination. And then also, more importantly, ensuring that the souring bilateral relationship, so Vance and others have mentioned this, does not really do material harm to the emissions reductions efforts that are underway in either country and the world. And there's already evidence of some of this harm. So I think these are ambitious objectives, but I think that's where US and China cooperation and dialogues on climate need to go. So let's focus on the decarbonization in the energy sector and what's in this Glasgow Declaration. I mean, it is very exciting. I was quite surprised when it came out because it seems quite difficult to get through any kind of agreement of cooperation with China these days. And in particular, there's a couple of elements on policies to encourage decarbonization and electrification of end-use sectors. Now, these are just placeholders, right? There's not a lot of detail in the declaration. But I mean, specific areas to highlight here. One is methane emissions, which many folks have talked about. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail of that because Ken Alex is going to focus on that next, but there are technologies associated with that are already very mature. Second is on policies that support the integration of high shares, low cost, intermittent renewable energy. This is a very, very important topic and one near and dear to my heart, focus of most of my research. And it really comes down to a couple of key things. One is markets. China is trying to stand up competitive wholesale markets, and it's been a very difficult transition for China to do so, to switch from a planning-based approach to the power sector to more competitive and market-based approaches. and the recent power shortages have shown how difficult and rocky that transition can be. In the US, we have significant experience at subnational level and in our regional markets on how to scale up renewables to very high penetrations into the 50% plus range. So there is certainly room for some sharing there. The third element is on transmission policies that encourage balancing of intermittent renewables across large geographies. I think this is very carefully worded because I'm not sure the overlap is quite as strong as it implies. I think in the US, the key barrier is transmission siting policies, and we have a very bifurcated transmission approval authority process. And the federal government has been trying to expedite this. In fact, in the recent legislation, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is trying to, and the DOE is trying to take back some of that control so that they can incentivize states to agree to siting these transmission lines that are in the national interest. Whereas in China, that's not so much the barriers that we're seeing for supply and demand across broad geographies. China already has the largest ultra high voltage transmission network anywhere in the world. Really what you're talking about in China is the inefficient utilization of transmission networks and protectionism at the provincial level that stymies interprovincial trading of renewables. So these are two different issues, but they both relate to transmission policies. And I think there could be some interesting discussions there. The fourth is on distributed generation policies. So this is combining solar and storage and other solutions that are closer to electricity users. This is a very, very hot topic in the US right now because resiliency in the face of extreme weather is driving a lot of interest in microgrids and localized generation and the ability to island in the case that the grid goes down. This happens in California now on an annual basis. It happens whenever there's a big storm out east. And secondarily, in the US, we've also had a pretty strong set of local policies that incentivize solar rooftops, so distributed solar through net metering policies and others. On the other hand, China, this really has not been a main feature of China's energy planning to date. But recent weather could indicate that there might be some shifts. China's been deploying overwhelmingly utility scale solar because it's more cost effective and because there hasn't been the same level of incentives at the localized level to install small scale solar on rooftops and others. And then the last one is energy efficiency policies and standards to reduce electricity waste. So my assessment of these elements is that most of these technologies are mature. You're talking about renewable energy, you're talking about transmission technologies, efficiency, methane, and really the policies here are focusing on deployment and efficient utilization. And I think those are very laudable goals, and I think there can have some really interesting conversations and discussions there. Some maturing technologies that are not in the agreement, most notably is electric vehicles, because this is the most important electrification of end-use sector. It's the most mature not yet electrified sector that both countries are rapidly pursuing. And I think it's quite obvious why it's not highlighted in here is because it's a strong area of competition between the countries, and they probably could not find sufficient agreement on how they want to discuss electric vehicles. And then finally, some technologies that are still emerging, but could have big impacts if we had some large scale demonstration and cooperation between the US and China. One is CCS. This is in the agreement. CCS, carbon capture and storage, is very expensive and it requires some consistent policy support. And the US has not done a good job on that to date. I think Chinese energy companies, in particular SOEs, have a key advantage in this because of the integration and the ability to streamline project development and to eat a lot of these costs. And I think there's still some potential for that. This was in the lead up to the Paris Agreement and one of the clean energy research centers and a lot of other discussions between the US and China. And I think we could have some continued discussions there. And then the last technology I'll mention is long duration storage. This is a wide open field. So most storage that we have on the grid today is about 4 hours and consists of lithium-ion batteries. And lithium-ion batteries have fallen in cost dramatically over the last decade or so, over 90%. And the DOE has further set a goal of reducing the cost of longer duration storage to an order of around $20 a kilowatt hour. That's their kind of goal. But really, if we're thinking about long duration storage and what is needed to integrate high levels of renewables, you need around $1 to $10 per kilowatt hour. So you're talking about an order of magnitude almost 2 orders of magnitude drop from current battery costs, that means we need some really, really good technology. We don't know what that chemistry is going to be yet. And I think there's a lot of potential for figuring out what that is and demonstrating and doing a lot of additional research into new materials and chemistries. So I'll stop there, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Michael. Now I'd like to turn over to Ken for some of his observation and comments on the methane part. Ken, over to you.
Thank you, Fan. Thanks everybody for joining, and to the California-China Climate Institute for sponsoring this. I'm something of a methane obsessive. I've been working on methane issues for a number of years. And I will say that it may be a bit of a unique topic because I think there are really quite a lot of possible areas of cooperation between the US and China. And since I focus quite a lot on California, between California and China. For those of you who are not methane obsessive, methane is the most important greenhouse gas after CO2. It is at least 25% of the human-induced warming is caused by methane. And it's also a short-lived climate pollutant, which means that if you were to stop emitting it, it would be out of the atmosphere in about 12 to 15 years, unlike CO2, which can last for hundreds of years. So all in all, methane is actually probably the largest single set of issues where we can make the most progress quickly. And it's actually fairly cost effective because methane is pretty much natural gas. So it can be, once captured, can be used as product. There are 4 primary sources of methane from the oil and gas sector, from the coal sector, from the agriculture sector, and from the landfill and waste sectors. They're a little bit different in China and in the US and California, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But as has been discussed, 2 of the most important outcomes from COP26 were the Global Methane Pledge and the US-China Joint Declaration, which includes methane. So the Global Methane Pledge was signed by about 105 countries at the time of the COP. It's actually a little bit more now. But as Deborah noted, China was not one of the signatories to that pledge. The pledge is pretty straightforward. It basically sets a goal of reducing methane emissions by 30% by 2030. But China's absence is important because it's a large source of methane emissions. But having said that, the Joint Declaration is very broad and in its scope around methane. And I actually want to read the wording of it because I think it sets out a number of things where I think cooperation is not only possible, but essential. So it says, recognizing specifically the significant role that emission of methane play in increasing temperatures, both countries consider increased action to control and reduce such emissions to be a matter of necessity in the 2020s. To this end, the 2 countries intend to cooperate to enhance measurement of methane emissions, to exchange information on the respective policies and programs for strengthening management and control of methane, and to foster joint research into methane emissions, reduction challenges, and solutions. The US has announced the US Methane Emissions Reduction Plan. Taking into account the above cooperation, the 2 sides intend to do the following before COP27. They intend to develop additional measures to enhance methane emissions control at both the national and subnational levels. In addition to its recently communicated NDC, China intends to develop a comprehensive and ambitious national action plan on methane, aiming to achieve significant effect on methane emissions control reduction in the 2020s. The US and China intend to convene a meeting in the first half of 2022 to focus on the specifics of enhancing measurement and mitigation of methane, including standards to reduce methane from the fossil and waste sectors, as well as incentives and programs to reduce methane from agriculture sector. That is an excellent statement of what we need to do. The US is working on quite a lot of this already, as is California. California is part of a consortium that is working to put satellites that measure methane emissions from point sources into orbit late next year, as is the Environmental Defense Fund. They have a separate satellite system. The two will work nicely together. And that will be important that China and the US agree, once that data is available, how transparent it is and how it can be presented and used, and how entities that are working to reduce emissions can take that information and move forward. California, as far as I know, is the only jurisdiction right now in the world with a legal requirement to reduce methane emissions. There's a law in California requiring a 40% emission reduction from baseline by 2030. The sources of emission in California and the US are a little bit different than China, at least in California, a little more similar in the US. In California, about 50% of methane emissions come from the agriculture sector, and of that, the majority of them come from livestock, particularly confined animal feeding operations. Second, about 20% comes from the oil and gas sector, and also another 20% comes from waste and landfill. In China, it's different. About a quarter of the emissions, 25% or so, come from coal, 12% from livestock, 8% from rice, which is a big source, and 12% from waste and landfill. Only 3% of China's methane emissions are from the oil and gas sector. But even with this, a little bit different set of emissions, California and the US would really gain quite a bit from cooperation. California, as we know, doesn't have much coal, although other parts of the US do. But even in California, the Air Resources Board actually has what's called a mine methane capture protocol, which provides methods to quantify greenhouse gas emission reductions associated with the capture and destruction of methane that would otherwise be vented into the atmosphere as a result of mining operations at both active underground and surface coal mines and abandoned underground coal mines. So that basic approach, I think, is ready almost off the shelf to be used more broadly in China and, frankly, in the rest of the United States. On the other side, China is, of course, the world leader in research on rice, including methane emissions and techniques to reduce those emissions. This is an area where scientists in California, UC Davis, among other places, are working. And among things that the scientists in China and in California are discovering is that reduction of methane emissions, various techniques to do so, actually may improve yields if done well. So there's a real opportunity there to work together to come up with some solutions. There's also, as I think Fan mentioned and some of the earlier speakers, there's an emphasis on subnational cooperation. And having worked in California, I think this is an area where we can make significant progress working directly, California and Chinese provinces, other states in the US that have made some progress on methane emissions in various sectors. Some of the work that we're doing at UC Berkeley at the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment, we've produced a couple of frameworks for methane reduction by sector. The first one is on oil and gas. The second one is on agriculture, which is a more complicated set of problems. We will be looking at doing similar frameworks for landfill and waste, and also for coal in the near future. And these really need input from China and elsewhere. And we look forward to seeing what's possible here. So I actually, on this particular set of issues, other speakers have talked about lots of the challenges and the difficulties, but around methane, I think, is perhaps one of the biggest opportunities between California and China, between the US and China, and frankly, worldwide. So I think this really sets some of the possibilities as we look forward on this particular set of issues. I will stop there and hand it back to Fan.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks for laying out the framework for the possible cooperation between California and the US and China on this particular issue, which is really helpful. Lastly, but not the least, we have Dongke to share some of her thoughts on the deforestation issue. Ke, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Fan. And thanks to California China Climate Institute for organizing this timely event, and also offering me this great opportunity to share some thoughts regarding the commitments by the US and China to jointly sort of eliminate the deforestation that come out of this COP26. And as you know, that carbon sequestration is one of the many gifts the forests offer to us. And when forests are cut down, so much of the stored carbon basically released to the atmosphere. So deforestation on its own causes about 10% of the global carbon emission. So between 2015 and 2020, the rate of deforestation was about 10 million hectares per year. So the main drivers for deforestation, as Deborah mentioned, that including illegal logging and the land conversion for crops and grazing. So agriculture conversion is responsible for about 60% of all deforestation today. And according to Forest Trends, about 49% of this agro conversion is illegal. So most of the forest loss occurs in carbon-rich and biodiversity-rich tropical countries, such as Amazon Basin for soy and beef, and Southeast Asia for palm oil and wood pulp, and Congo Basin for timber. And some of you may still remember this 2014 New York Declaration on Forests. And there, more than 200 governments, companies, indigenous groups, and NGOs pledged to cut the natural forest loss in half by 2020 and try to end it by 2030. And today is 2021. So unfortunately, the declaration hasn't really lived up to its ambition. So deforestation continues, and the primary rainforest deforestation increased 12% last year. So this evidence showed to us that such commitments are relatively easy to make, but very hard to achieve. And the Glasgow Declaration provided us more hope, I hope. And even though we know how much heavy lifting must happen over the next 8 years to really achieve the goals by 2030. So the paragraph number 10 of the US-China Glasgow Declaration is the first time that China has clearly stated that it is going to ban the illegal imports of products linked to deforestation. So to me, the key word is imports. So China is now the global largest importer of soy, beef, and timber, and the second largest importer of palm oil after India. So if this commitment achieved, there will have an enormous impact on protecting global forests. And in fact, China has been involved in this global forest governance discussion for about 20 years. in this process, China has participated in several bilateral and multilateral initiatives, including the US-China Bilateral Forum on Illegal Logging and associated trade launched in 2007. So Chinese government and research institutions, industrial associations, and timber companies and NGOs worked together in the past 20 years to find solutions. So for example, China developed several voluntary measures, such as in 2017, China Timber Legality Verification Standard was released by China National Forest Products Industrial Association. And in 2019, 2 years ago, Chinese Academy of Forestry published the Congo country-specific handbook on sustainable overseas forest investment and trade by Chinese enterprises. So all these efforts basically are to help Chinese companies to be aware of laws and regulation in producer countries, implement due diligence, and keep illegal timber out of their supply chain. And some of you may have already known this as well. In July 2020, China's new forest law came into force. Its Article 65 proclaims a ban on buying, transporting, and/or processing illegally sourced timber. So Chinese government currently is developing or looking into amending implementing rules that will detail the enforcement of the new forest law. It has been very vague so far if the Article 65 will apply to imported timber or not. So to me, the US-China Glasgow Declaration provided a clearer guidance for effectively enforcing respective laws on banning illegal imports. So both sides need to have to make the efforts to develop some laws first. So what lessons I have learned in this process? So the first I learned is effectiveness of voluntary approach is limited. So evidence have shown that non-binding, voluntary, self-disciplined approaches have made limited progress. So in other words, both sides need regulation and mandatory requirements. So secondly, difficulties arise from increasing supply chain complexity. So this type of complexity imposes a significant burden for private sector to ensure supply chain transparency and traceability. And third is the complexity of cross-sector collaboration. So Ministry of Ecology and the Environment, MEE, is the leading agency for climate negotiation. And the Ministry of Commerce manages the international trade of all these soft commodities. And the General Administration of Customs is responsible for these products' customs clearance. And National Forestry and Grassland Administration is responsible for developing forest regulation. So it's complicated. So developing coordinated, comprehensive cross-sector working mechanism is not easy. And moving forward, so to possibly curb global illegal deforestation successfully, or even achieve zero deforestation by 2030, collective actions, between China, US, and other producer-consumer countries are critical. So I share with you a few thoughts for discussion. So firstly, I think enhancing China's domestic effort is very important, which includes establishing a cross-sector committee consisting all these relevant ministries to design and implement regulation and policies to prevent deforestation imports and enforcement of this regulation effectively. And the financial institutions can also play a role in China to incorporate supply chain sustainability into their investment risk assessment and increasing financial support for sustainable procurement. And in China, domestically, raising awareness for influential Chinese business and also strengthening domestic demand and the market for responsible commodities is also kind of important. So secondly, collaborating with the commodity producer countries. So right now, China and US, have jointly had this commitment, which can send a strong signal, market signal and policy signal to favor legal and responsible sourced commodity to producer countries. So ultimately, the legal and the sustainable management have to happen in producer countries where illegal deforestation occurs. So local law enforcement and the governance in these producer countries need to be strengthened and improved. So finally, and several speakers mentioned about the collaboration between China and the US and maybe other discerning market countries like EU and the UK. So right now, I know that the US, EU and UK are developing legislation to prohibit the importation of illegal deforestation commodities. So their experience and the law enforcement models can be useful for China. And also a high level engagement between China and the US and EU is imperative so that clear goals can be provided and reach out to high level government, Chinese government counterparts. So high level participation from China is essential if it aims to put in place legislation to eliminate illegal deforestation imports. So to close my remarks, I would like to share with you a Chinese saying, 言必行，行必果. So in English, it's a promise must be kept and action must be resolute indeed. So I hope China and the US will stick with what both have promised, develop a concrete action plan and walk the talk together. Thank you, Fan. Back to you.
Thank you, Ke. That was really insightful. A lot of thoughts to digest. Even for me, I think there's a lot of information just on this topic as well. I know we have a couple more minutes left for today's discussion, but I'd like to start for this Q&A session. I'd like to start with one question. I know some of the speakers today already mentioned this working group, which was part of this joint declaration. And we also know that back in 2015, there was this climate change working group between the US and China. So my question to you all, for all the speakers today is, in your view, how this working group today should or could be different in terms of the way to set it up and, priorities for such a working mechanism versus the working group that was formed during the Obama administration. I know Vance probably has a lot to share on this, but I like to hear thoughts from all of you on this working group question. Maybe Vance, we can start with you.
Sure, I'm happy to start, and thanks for the question. Since I was the leader of the US-China Climate Change Working Group from the period 2014 to 2017, I think there's a few things which have changed since that time. On the one hand, a lot of the speakers have talked about how the US-China relationship has become more challenging. And so the political environment for cooperation is not as favorable as it was back then. I mean, back then we had varied, robust cooperation across different agencies, and both countries called climate change a pillar of the bilateral relationship. It was a sort of, highlight of the US-China relationship. The relationship has changed so much over the last few years that it's going to be hard to return to that, let's help each other and constructively engage at jointly solving this climate crisis. At the same time, I think we have to recognize that domestic capacity in China to address and tackle climate challenges has also improved dramatically and is probably comparable to what we have in the United States. Right. So there's no longer a need for the type of cooperation, especially in the 90s and the 2000s, where international experts would come to China and teach China international expertise, and then China would sort of adopt that for the local circumstances. Now China is tackling its own challenges, has its own expertise, its own custom situation, and certainly that needs to be informed by international best practice, but it's not an importing situation, just in the same way that the US has a lot to learn from China's approach to things, and so this is much more two-way. But so that being said, I think that the future of the working group is going to be much less quote unquote traditional cooperation, where we have here's power sector, here's transportation, here's energy efficiency, let's get together and work together and help each other. But rather, I'd like to see the cooperation focus on two main things. One is extremely robust sharing of respective domestic policy progress so that the countries have confidence in each other's own domestic transformations, can ask questions, understand what the other country is doing, and in doing so have confidence, but also maybe learn some lessons for their own. But the other thing is I'd like to see the cooperation focus on emerging long-term challenges that are jointly faced by both countries. And I think the Joint Declaration highlights this well. Things like methane emissions accounting and control is an emerging challenge for both countries. CCS or CDR development and deployment, just transition, long-term pathways to deep decarbonization, high renewables penetration. These are areas where it's not transportation sector or electric vehicles, which both countries are already very mature and working well on, and that those areas may be ripe for competition. Maybe Debbie will talk about that. But it's really focusing those areas where we can have substantive engage, work together on unlocking and sharing experience on modeling or inventories, learn from each other, while also having confidence in the other's action.
Thanks, Vance. Sure, looks like you have a hand up. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree with Vance. In particular, I think the working group should focus on policy dialogue and exchanges, both sides trying to understand, the other, their policy intention. And I think the conversation should really, be focused, where at least a big part should be on implementation. How will, the pledges that are announced will be delivered. I also think that there is a time sensitivity in this conversation. I think the joint statement has clearly outlined that some of the exercises will be conducted already in early 2022. So kind of the time for engagement, I think this is also responding to one of the questions raised by the audience. The time for engagement is now. It is not January or February next year, it is now. I think the other thing for the working group is we have to consider how to make it future-proof or be more forward-looking in anticipation of the turbulence in a broader bilateral relationship, and to kind of think back to what we should do within the working group to make it resilient, given the political situation between the two countries. And in this regard, I do want to highlight something that Vance has also mentioned, I think, which is if you read the last paragraph in the joint statement, which deals with the joint working group, it has name-checked a few stakeholders, not just governmental, but also non-governmental stakeholders. I think having their participation and contribution to the working group and also the broader bilateral climate dialogue will actually be quite helpful.
Thank you, Shuo. That's really important. And I agree personally too. I think subnational governments and those non-governmental participants should definitely be very, very helpful in this process in the working group. Deborah, it looks like you have hand out too. Do you want to offer some insights?
Yeah, I'm gonna disagree a little bit, I think. So first of all, we've had working groups like this for more than 30 years at this point, right? This was not an invention of the Obama administration. And they've been more and less useful. I mean, I think we had 60 different working groups going during the Bush administration, and we didn't make a great deal of progress on climate change. So I think it's really important. and when Xiaohua says future proof, I completely agree that that's important. And I think one of the ways that's important is by having the things that don't really need federal government involvement to not involve the federal government. So one of the things that I think has made the California-China climate cooperation works so well is that the federal government really has nothing to do with it and never really did. And so I think, especially when we talk about state and local government, I mean, the truth is, you know, I've been involved in a bunch of these things where people decide that Greenwood, Kansas is a good example for China, and it has 2,000 people in it. California is useful because California is large and has a very large economy and many people, right? So I think, you know, there have been other great programs from other parts of the country, but I do think that to some extent, we now have this alliance that involves state and local governments, and that can work directly. Keeping the federal government out of it may be useful. Similarly, I think the same is true for mature technologies. We have a lot of technology issues between the US and China, and trying to bring those into this kind of a discussion simply will create all kinds of trade and technology tensions. So and interestingly, I also think that measurement is not going to be something that we absolutely have to discuss for the reasons that Ken brought up, which is that more and more this is all going to come from satellites. And we don't really have to compare each other's results because we can just look at them ourselves and they can look at ours. So what do I think we actually can do? A couple things. One is talk about what our goals are. I realize that isn't something that takes a great deal of time, but as Xiaohua pointed out, we do have to keep increasing the level of commitment, and that's something the two countries have to keep talking about. The second is an issue that is actually mentioned in the joint agreement, and Vance mentioned briefly, which is this question of just transition. I mean, both countries face tremendous challenges with how to help our workers transition to a new economy, how we deal with areas of the country that are going to get left behind. And I think we can share best practices because it's not a sort of technologically competitive area, and we can learn from each other because neither of us know what we're doing. And it's new and we have a lot of challenges. And then the other area I still think is we have to talk about finance, and we have to figure out how to finance adaptation and clean energy transition in developing countries. And this is an area that we continue to have to talk to. Now, I do also think that the areas that Dong was talking about really are areas where we're going to be able to cooperate relatively easily. This whole sort of legal structure for enforcing rules on timber, the US adapted from the Lacey Act, which is now, I think, a 100-year-old act. And then we did a lot of work talking with Chinese government counterparts on how to do that regulation. And I think as we move into this new area where I assume in the US, we will once again adapt the Lacey Act of dealing with the products of deforested land instead of the timber itself, that again, we can talk about creative ways to adapt our legislation. And also there's going to be some useful information sharing in terms of enforcement. But I really think overstating what we can do is actually dangerous. And for areas where, whether it's state and local government or business or academia is already working together well directly, it's better for us to encourage that rather than to have the government jump into the middle.
Great, that's very interesting, and we like this disagreement. I don't know, Xiaohua, you raised your hand. Do you have something to add or disagree with?
No, just in the spirit of being interactive. No, I completely understand Debbie's working group fatigue. I actually agree with that. I think we need to be very selective. We need to be surgical in terms of where we should deploy the energy of two governments, right? But I think on the other hand, and this is kind of the nuance, right, of U.S.-China diplomatic engagement, where it will work, where it will add value. I think to me, a big part of the working group is to ensure that we preserve this layer of policy dialogue, right, that Vance mentioned. And I think that is important for the simple reason that that policy dialogue has served us well. I mean, even if you just look at the last 10 months or so, when the two countries are having this policy dialogue, right? Not under kind of a formal framework, but they are anyways talking to each other. That has triggered some changes, right? I am not saying these changes are the silver bullets that will solve the climate challenge, but it nudges at least China towards, a better direction. The examples that I mentioned, the commitment to peak coal by 2025, even though that is already embedded in some way in the Chinese NDC, but also, the overseas coal moratorium. Again, I am not saying it is only because of the engagement that made that, these Chinese announcements possible. There are many other factors, but I think conversely, if we don't have engagement, I do not necessarily see that some of these announcements and pledges will be made from the Chinese side. So I think that's kind of the nuance of the bilateral engagement.
Great. We have Michael and then Ke for a quick comment on this one.
Yeah, I wanted to draw on this a little bit because I feel like the definition of the working group, in order to generate, for example, diplomatic successes, we may run into the potential pitfall of reducing it to a very small amount of issues, which are only really influential on the margins. And I totally see Debbie's point that the federal government shouldn't be inserting itself into issues that could be more resilient to changes in administration, because frankly, the Chinese are very cognizant. They're looking at 2024, and why would they commit to doing lots of things now if the administration and their approach to climate change could change very soon? But I think we live in a world where the federal governments have inserted themselves. We're no longer existing in a vacuum. And I think I actually envision there could be a lot more robust, and this is probably beyond the scope of this working group, but I think there should be a lot more enhanced bilateral discussion between the US and China on areas of trade and supply chains, ensuring that you have efficient, globalized, and responsible supply chains that are already interfering with our ability to deliver low cost, low carbon tech. That's absolutely critical. Technology development. These are all issues that are significantly more salient now than they were during the previous working group. And these are areas where the national governments on both sides have become increasingly more intrusive. So it's really not a matter of getting the federal government out or involving the federal government where they don't belong. It's trying to establish, and some folks have called them guardrails, but I think we could probably be a little bit more proactive and say we can have some focused discussions on how we can actually create some rules of the road around trade, technology development, and even the increasing securitization of a lot of elements of climate change technology. And I just think there's enormous more scope for the climate change discussions than what we saw, and the need than what we saw under previous iterations.
Thanks, Michael. Ke?
Thanks, Ben. So just to quickly sort of echo what Shuo just mentioned, I think we shouldn't underestimate the peer pressure. I think the China-US collaboration is quite important. And, I think the high-level political dialogue can be quite important to maintain and even elevate the political will to make some actions. And also, I think it's likely China will not take the leading role to really develop some, regulation, legislation for this global deforestation. However, if the US, EU, UK really put in place the regulation, I think China will sort of learn from these, countries and the models, and so with certain level of the political support. So I just would like to echo what Shuo mentioned, that the high level political dialogue need to keep and maintain.
Thanks, Ke. We have a couple of questions from the audience in the Q&A box. I'd like to start with this one. I think Siping asked for, this is about the role of philanthropic and NGO sector, prioritizing their work based on US-China Declaration. I wonder if Vance or somebody wants to take this one on, just share your thoughts about that kind of role of philanthropic and NGO in supporting or leverage the openings in this space since the declaration.
Sure. I'll try to be quick to leave room because I'm curious what others think also. Look, philanthropy has more than a 20-year history of supporting constructive US-China engagement and dialogue, sharing best practices, and I really hope that this will continue. I also have a unique window right now to throw some support behind nurturing this working group to actually become successful for two reasons. Number one, we're well past any time where government alone can solve these challenges, right? So like during the Obama administration, in the run up to Paris, it was very much a track one dialogue. We structure this agreement, and in some respects, we didn't necessarily want track two because we wanted to have this very candid series of track one negotiations leading up to Paris. Now it's the opposite, right? We're in this implementation agenda where we need all of society's support, and philanthropy is going to be key to bringing everyone to the table for these dialogues. Secondly, within the structure of the new working group, non-government participation is going to make these outcomes stronger, right? So my experience in government was that the government didn't always have the latest top-notch research results at our fingertips, right? And if we have a structure with strong expert engagement, people like Michael and Debbie can bring their most recent publications and feed that into the dialogue. And in doing so, it increases trust, right? Because you have this sort of apolitical technical engagement, and it'll help to bolster the whole track one dialogue, which is still very nascent, right? And I think that philanthropy plays a really key role in making sure that this brand new, bird gets flying out into the world strong and doesn't fall into the pitfalls of poor trust, or the sense that that the U.S. is only pushing action on China to try to contain China or hold China down. So I would encourage philanthropy to lean in all the areas, but especially the areas in the working group.
Great. Ken and Shaw, comments.
Yeah, I obviously the dialogues, whether it's track one or two, are very important, and philanthropy plays a role. But I always want to get to the actual implementation. And so I hope that a role for philanthropy is to think about pilot projects, think about exchanges, think about how we scale things and how we move things more quickly. There's a relationship to all the dialogues, but to me, those are the places where philanthropy and NGOs can make really a significant difference.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think this is just saying what Vance and Ken has already said in a different way. I think if you look at US-China engagement on some issues, we are moving from identifying the problems, right, to providing solutions. I think two examples: one is overseas coal from the Chinese perspective; the other one is deforestation that Dunke just mentioned. In a way, the job of diplomacy has already been completed. And there needs to be, more stakeholders that feel sort of into the gap of how do we actually provide a solution and implementation. I think, NGO and philanthropical organizations can play a role. And just very quickly going back to one point that Michael mentioned, I think in the previous round, I think it is a very important point, which is, the supply chain issue and some of the other problems now in the climate field. Should the working group have a role on those issues, right? Traditionally, the climate joint working group is about sort of outlining the issues to create a better bilateral relationship, if you will. But now, because of the turbulent bilateral relationship, it has actually created a lot of politically thorny issues that are also related to climate energy. So the new question is, should the working group have a role on those issues? And I think this is an important emerging issue that we need to think about very carefully.
Thanks, Sure. Just quickly to add to that, and we'll go to Deborah for comments on this one. There is a question from the audience. Jennifer is asking about this related to the supply chain, this sustainable lithium and battery metals. Do you think, something around this? And she's asking about human rights abuses. Do you think this will be something could put on the agenda of the working group, or just in general working together? This is a question for Michael, I believe.
Well, I can take a stab at this, but I know other folks have thoughts on this as well. I would love to see a commitment by both countries to ensure efficient, globalized, and responsible supply chains for all of our low carbon materials. I think in storage, but I think in these cases, it's gonna be a lot more difficult than, for example, in the illegal deforestation commodities that Ko was talking about, because US and China do not have a shared understanding of the nature of the problem here. And this is particularly in solar, right? The two sides absolutely do not agree that they're the same problem on the nature of the problem. I think there is a scope for Chinese firms to engage in some standards in this. So for example, the Solar Energy Industry Association in the US, SEIA, has put forward a sourcing protocol, which I think will be very difficult to implement. But if there have more robust aspects to that, Chinese firms seeking to capture the US market may participate. I think on storage, it could be more interesting. So we're talking about lithium and cobalt. These are primarily in third countries. I think you could potentially generate some shared understanding there. But there, the US problem with China is much more about the concentration of the processing of those materials. And that's something where both sides are not really going to see eye to eye, because the US solution to that is going to be to diversify and create competitive processing industries outside of China. So I think it's somewhat of a different issue, but narrowly on lithium and cobalt extraction, potentially.
Thank you, Michael. I know we're running a bit out of time here, but wanted to turn over to Deborah, maybe for kind of wrapping us up with your final comments.
So the bulk of the work to mitigate catastrophic climate change is going to be domestic work in both countries. And the most important thing that NGOs and philanthropies can do is keep the pressure on each country for domestic action. I agree with everybody that there are a wide variety of other ways that it can do it. And in fact, because I believe that if there are ways for academics, NGOs, companies to work with each other that don't involve the two governments, that's a good idea. That's a great role for philanthropy to foster some of those interactions. I also would suggest that I don't think either country is going to be very interested in bringing a bunch of trade issues into the climate discussion. Our climate discussions have been productive in part because we have kept those issues separate, and I don't think there's a constituency in either country. I certainly don't see one from either the Trade Representative Catherine Tai or the Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo that are going to be pushing in that direction. So I would be very surprised to see supply chains and that kind of thing brought into the climate conversation. I do think that our companies are going to be creative and they're going to find new ways to source. And many of these problems are going to be solved through the private sector. And I absolutely agree with everyone that it's great that we're back to talking to each other. We absolutely have to have goals that we work on together. And it's also equally critical that we're all pressuring our own governments to do more. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And thank you to all the panelists for very rich and enlightening conversation today. We hope the audience also found the discussion valuable. The event will later be available on our website. I'd like to thank you all again for joining us. Till the next one. Thank you.